Hello, everyone. Welcome back.
Hi, everybody.
Back to the Babbling Pastor Podcast.
Were we being secretive?
I was trying to do like the ASMR version. I still don't know what ASMR stands for, but I know it's like when people whisper. And
okay.
You can hear the pages turning. I don't know what the appeal is, but apparently there's an appeal. So
I'll try to do better.
Well, you should, Rob. I feel bad, like for no reason, like chastising you. Do people use the word chastise anymore?
I'm sure that's some form of politically incorrect at this point.
Okay. You're just gonna add it because why not? Like it probably is. We'll just put it on a list somewhere. Well, you know who is chastising people?
Jude.
What? Yes, exactly. I was hoping that connection would be made. Yes.
Excellent.
Look at that segue. That was amazing.
It's like we get paid to do this.
Well, I don't like to brag about the millions of dollars that this podcast brings in. Yeah. But now people know. Now they know that. I mean, I know you just bought that new Lambo. I hope you like it. My helicopter is supposed to be delivered today, and
well, here I would need to get some good snow tires on my Lambo and maybe make sure it's all-wheel drive.
You're gonna like lift kit it like it's like a monster truck.
Maybe some air ride suspension. I don't know.
I mean, but you can afford it with all of the money.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah. I mean, we're gonna meet later today at Kenneth Copeland's house and go over Jude. So.
Yeah. Someone should.
All right, so guys, if you missed the first episode, we covered verses 1 through 7 last week, and today we're going to be looking at 8 through 13. And I actually told you, if you listened to last week's episode, you could have read ahead and been prepared. So yeah, I don't know. Hopefully you did. So verses 8 through 13. Are we ready? Are we ready? Are we in the zone and ready to hear God's word?
Yeah, I was born ready, man.
You were born depraved. But anyway, let's go into it. So verse 8. Yet in like manner, these people also, relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious ones. But when the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing over the body of Moses, he did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." But these people blaspheme all that they do not understand, and they are destroyed by all that they, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively. Woe to them, for they walk in the way of Cain and have abandoned themselves for the sake of Balaam's error and perished in Korah's rebellion. These are hidden reefs at your love feast, as they feast with you without fear, shepherds feeding themselves, waterless clouds swept along by winds, fruitless trees in late autumn, twice dead, uprooted, wild waves at the sea, casting up the foam of their own shame, wandering stars for whom the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved forever. I mean, he definitely looks at them so I don't even have words for it. He does.
I think he used all the ones that are needed.
So it's important. Most of these episodes, guys, most of our podcasts, you don't really have to listen to the last ones, but it's at least important that you read verses 1 through 7 before you get into this episode, because the yet in like manner is an important connector to those verses. You kind of have to know what came before to know what he's talking about here. So
yeah, I think it's interesting. So there's a just to get us kicked off here, I guess. There's a I don't want to say a fight. I think for some people it's a fight. But there's a difference in doctrine, and I think we've maybe touched on it a little bit here or there, but there are people who would say that they are what's called cessationist, and then the opposition to that is continuationist.
Mm-hmm.
And what all that means is that some of the spiritual gifts, a cessationist would say that some of the miraculous kind of spiritual gifts, such as tongues or healing or prophecy, that sort of thing, have ceased.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, cessationist, right? That those things are no more because we have the scriptures. Some people say, no, those things there's no reason to think that those haven't continued. They are continuationists. I don't think that either of those things here are, I don't think this is about that fight. I'll say that this first verse we're covering, verse 8. But I do think that one of the dangers that you see play out practically, trying to bring it into our era here a little bit, with this. So when he says, yet in like manner, these people he's talking about, he's bringing it back. He's just used these examples, right, from the Old Testament and the past. And so these people, he's bringing it back to the false teachers he's talking about. When he says these people, also relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, and reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious ones. That the issue going on there is that they'll maybe have dreams or visions or whatever. And frankly, if you're using dreams or visions to do what they're doing, which is essentially to justify their sinful behaviors, mm-hmm. Well, chances are you're not actually having dreams or visions. You're just lying.
Yeah.
But the issue, so a cessationist will say, see, there's the danger right there. Anybody can say I had a vision or a prophetic utterance or whatever. But I think that the issue here at least is that you can't rely on your dreams alone. If you're a continuationist, fine. I actually am a continuationist as well. But you also can't say, as these guys are, there's no room for, well, I had a vision and so this is okay. Mm-hmm. Or I had a vision, so I'm going to go do this, if it's counter to Scripture.
Yep.
If it's counter to the authority of Scripture. And that's what you have going on here. And this is actually really classic, like, false teacher stuff.
Oh yeah.
Right. I mean, any of the big names that get like pounded on today, Benny Hinn maybe being one of the most famous, Kenneth Copeland you mentioned, right? But any of these kind of guys, man, if they read that in context, that one verse would negate their entire ministry. Right? I mean,
God told me. Yeah, he told me right there. He spoke the word to me. Yeah.
I think I really like that verse because, again, one of the things I love about Jude, the whole book, the huge book of Jude, is
the enormous 25 verses.
Yeah, is that it's all so, even the way that he words it, it's all so relevant today. Mm-hmm. It speaks to, if there's one major takeaway for the Christian from the whole book of Jude, it would be, look, nothing changes, right? Like nothing is new under the sun. So we still must contend for the faith, right? Like, mm-hmm. Because all these things that he mentions, that this is just stuff that continues on today.
For sure. Well, and I think it's important to note, like, so he says, yet like in like manner. So referring back to, hey, those that were taken out of Egypt but were destroyed because they didn't believe, the angels that left their proper position, those mm-hmm. in Sodom and Gomorrah. So like these false teachers, they're relying on their dreams, they're defiling the flesh, they're rejecting authority, they're blaspheming the glorious ones. The idea here is that, like, so every example that I just gave you, this is the exact thing that these teachers are doing then. And they're doing it, it seems to be, I mean, especially, and we're going to see this fleshed out as we go through these verses, they're doing it with the idea that it's for their gain, their good, and they're the authority on it. That's so you can't question them. It's the idea that, like, I had this dream. I mean, that seems to be really the thing that kind of kicks it all off. Like, I heard this, Jesus told me this, and now you have to listen to me about it. And that's where, and this is where I think for a lot of people, probably you and I would kind of have the same sense on this, that going into verse 9, this is where it gets a little confusing for a lot of people, because there's this idea that, like, so this is where Jude also goes back, for example, to the people that he's talking to are going to be aware of things that we, coming to the text, may not be incredibly aware of. So, for example, he mentions here, verse 9, but when the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing over the body of Moses, he did not presume to pronounce blasphemous judgment, but said, the Lord rebuke you. Now, he's referring to a document we don't even have the full documentation of. We have bits and pieces too. It's the Meditations of Moses, or the Presumptions of Moses. I forget exactly the title.
Moses.
Huh?
I think it's the Testament of Moses.
Maybe it's the Testament of Moses. But there are things that Jude, the important takeaway here, there are obviously things that Jude said, this is important and this happened, right? So it's not canonical, it's not within Scripture, but he clearly saw as important teaching tools. This being one of them. He's actually going to mention Enoch later. That, again, he's not holding up as like super high authority, because, I mean, clearly he would have held the Torah and the prophets higher than these documentations. But he says that these are, according to Jude, these things happened and they're reliable and you can learn from them. But the example that he's using here specifically speaks to like this idea that it kind of plays into what we talked about in the first episode, where he's not using his authority to say, like, you have to listen to me. He's literally doing the exact same thing that he uses in the example here, where he says, even the archangel Michael, when contending with the devil, disputing over the body of Moses, didn't presume to pronounce in his authority, you shut up. It was, he said, the Lord rebuke you. So he's setting up this dichotomy that, like, anybody that sets them up as this like high authority over God, you need to stay away from. Clearly. And then verse 10, but these, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively, woe to them. They have, we'll get into verse 11 here in a minute. But the idea, because these are the examples that he kind of plays out on, basically walking out verse 8. But there's this clear issue that he's having here, that he's really, a lot of what Paul did, honestly, in a lot of his letters, where he's contending with people that are like, hey, look at all this authority I have. You have to listen to me. And he's pushing it back at them, saying, do you think you're higher than God? You think your dream that negates what God has already said is better than what God has already said? So specifically in sexual immorality and idolatry.
Which is ironic. Don't
you think? Isn't it ironic? Yeah. I'm sorry, no more Alanis Morissette.
Because that's, again, like that's the chief issue in our culture today, is the same thing.
Mm-hmm. We've just combined them. We've made sexual immorality an idol.
Yeah, right. and it is, when, keeping with some of the theme and purpose of our podcast in general, right, which has really just been cultural, whatever, like engagement with Christianity, sort of. But this speaks directly to that, right? Like all of the things that that we see happening before us today, that are the most argued, and that the maybe the biggest things in our culture, right? A lot of them are things like abortion, right? Homosexual marriage, right? or behavior in general, right? And transgenderism. This all just bleeds of, I want to be whatever I want to be sexually. I want you to shut up about it.
Well, I'm the authority on it. Like, I have say over God.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this hasn't changed. And in fact, that was the problem, as we read last week. That was the same problem that was happening in Sodom. So it's pretty old, right? And before that, it was the same problem that was happening before the flood, apparently, right? With angels. And so it's this whole thing, sexual immorality. It's no wonder, right, that it has become, that it's such a thorn in the side. It always has been. And so when he's writing to, these are people who are, we could generally take this letter, all that we're reading about it, and use it to just talk about false teaching in general, right? But and you correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the closest correlation would be those who are spiritual leaders of some sort, or elders, at least in churches or whatever. But there are a lot of pastors, professors, things like that, who have this like studied, learned, who are now saying that actually homosexuality is not a sin, it's fine. And they're even, they might, some of them will even talk about how abortion is a tragedy, but it's okay, or it's necessary because of the health of a woman. And so you have people who are actually exercising some sort of authority in the church world, and doing the exact same thing in our own culture, making what is unbiblical biblical because I say so, essentially.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think to go even beyond those two things, I think it goes back even further than that, because there are, now again, I'm sure the examples that I'm aware of, I would say, are more fringe, but the fact that I only say that because I've only heard them on video a few times. I mean, who knows what happens in each church every Sunday, that just nobody knows. So, but there are people that I've heard speak before that, I mean, outside of the homosexuality discussion and the abortion discussion, there are people that are advocating, and by people I mean pastors that are over churches, that are advocating for, like, for example, the absolution of marriage because you don't love each other anymore and you've fallen in love with this other person, and you can go pursue that now. Or multiple partner relationships in very extreme situations. But the idea is that whether it be extreme or not, this is what Jude is dealing with. This is a teaching in this church. That's his concern. He doesn't care if it's proliferated all of the churches in the area. The problem is it's in this church and it needs to be taken care of. So even if it is one person saying it, it's a problem.
Yeah.
And what happens from that, you have lots of churches that, I mean, that's much more common, that are just okay with being like, well, gender's social construct. And these are not people outside of the church. These are leaders within the church that will say gender is a social construct and there are no such thing as like a gender roles or roles in marriage or roles in the church. And they'll just do away with all of that. Which again, this is not necessarily what he's talking specifically about sexual immorality, but I don't think you can uncouple those two things. Sexual immorality and gender understanding and roles, they go together. You don't have one without the other. So the idea that, what Jude is speaking of, and again, these people will do exactly what Jude is saying. They will use scripture to make what they're saying okay. And do the exact thing that he said last time when we talked about. Well, what verse is that? Verse 4, the end of it, where they have perverted the grace of our God into sensuality. And the idea that they're taking the grace of God and being like, well, how, I saw a quote the other day. You can talk about a judgmental God all day and people agree with you. But if you talk about a God that is too inclusive and too loving, people are on your back about it. Well, this is what Jude's talking about. You've taken his grace to an extreme in which God doesn't take it. And you've made it his grace, like co-sign your sensuality when he doesn't do that. And then you've used your authority within the church, all of your massive degrees and all of the ways that you can, talk above people where they don't understand what you're saying. Like, well, here and the culture and the Hebrew and the da-da-da, and you're just too stupid to understand what I'm saying, but just believe me. Like that sort of idea I'd say, just reading this, exactly what Jude's dealing with. He's got people that are in authority. They're like, hey, guys, don't worry about it. We had a dream. We've looked at this before. It's cool. And, they're using that.
And not only, like, I find it interesting that word sensuality, right? Is, and yeah, we went backwards, right? But that word sensuality is a it's more than just sexual immorality.
Oh yeah.
Right? That the word that's being used there by Jude speaks to all sorts of things. It speaks to this idea that it's kind of whatever I want, I'm going to go take. Right? Don't tell me what to do. I want to please myself, however I need to do that. Right? Now, because we're pretty sexual creatures, right? That often, I mean, that's what happens. Yeah. Right? But that this would also include, I mean, food for that matter, whatever it is, right? That I just, the point is, it's all about me. It's about pleasing me, about pleasing my flesh. Every desire that I might have in the moment, whether good, bad, or ugly, doesn't matter.
Yeah. And it's not just saying that; it's using God's grace to say that it's okay.
Yeah. By pervert the grace of our God into sensuality. Well,
and Jude's point, and I think something that all of us can learn, because you said it in the last episode lots of times, like, we don't have the balance that Jude has, which I agree with. And Jude doesn't come up and try to push his authority against theirs. He just says, he uses the example of Michael and the devil, and he says, all Michael said was, the Lord rebuke you. Like, the Lord do it. His authority is enough to settle this conversation. It doesn't need nothing else. Like, nothing else needs to be said. The Lord rebuke you. And that's all it was. There you go. That's how he dealt with it. And then he gets into some really scandalous examples in verse 11 that are like, they're a little, like, it's not, again, the people that he's talking to are going to understand this a little bit better, clearly, because they know the stories, and a lot of us know some of these stories. But he takes, what I love is the Balaam example. That everybody's like, oh, the talky donkey, and he takes it to he takes it to the core of what the story's actually about. So verse 11, woe to them, for they walk in the way of Cain and abandon themselves for the sake of gain, to Balaam's error, and perish in Korah's rebellion. So he mentions Cain, he mentions Balaam, and he mentions Korah's rebellion. None of these characters are great, by the way. I think all of us know the Cain and Abel story, right? So he's literally comparing them to, they walk in the way of a murderer. So good job there, I guess. And abandon themselves for the sake of gain, to Balaam's error. Now, this is the one, so I think we're really familiar with Cain and Abel. Like, everybody kind of knows that story. The Balaam thing I found really interesting. Are you familiar with it enough to kind of break it down real quick for us? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Break it down.
As far as what he's talking about here, the error of Balaam.
Well, Balaam, so essentially, Balaam, so this is from Numbers 20, I don't know, like
it's 20, like 4 chapters. It's a lot. Yeah.
20, yeah, something like that. I think it starts anyway. And he essentially the big crime is that he spoke against God's people. I mean, it's not about the donkey. He spoke against God's people, and trying to find where
it's near the end. I read through all of it looking for exactly what Jude was talking about, and then I was like, oh, this is the last chapter. That's all I needed.
Yeah. So it would be Numbers 24, I think.
Yeah. Like I said, it's like 5 chapters. It's crazy long going through the whole thing.
Yeah.
I don't even know what verse here. Let me see. What you're looking for it. So the gist of it, as he's getting to the last part, is that like, so he's been asked to speak against God's people so that the warring army, and I forget exactly which king it is, has tried to pay him to speak against the Lord's army. And God gives him a couple different visions, and each time he's like, okay, well, I can't do that because I can only speak what God tells me to speak. And then near the end, and like I said, I can't remember exactly chapter verse here. I don't know if you're close. There gets to a point where Balaam.
So just what he's talking about in verse 10 of chapter 24. Balak's anger was kindled against Balaam, and he struck his hands together, and Balak said to Balaam, I called you to curse my enemies, and behold, you've blessed them these 3 times. Therefore now flee to your own place. I said, I will certainly honor you, but the Lord has held you back from honor. And Balaam said to Balak, did I not tell your messengers whom you sent to me? If Balak should give me his house full of silver and gold, I would not be able to go. So he then proceeds with this final oracle, right? The oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down with his eyes uncovered. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. The star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down the
On this note, there's these oracles that he does are very interesting to read through. They're very trippy. Like it's one of those. And as you're getting to the point you're looking for, so Balaam, just so you guys know, Balaam wasn't like a Jewish prophet. Like it was very interesting how this all works out. Like he wasn't Jewish, I guess is the best way to say it. Like God uses him to speak things, but he wasn't part of Israel in regards to. I think I'm right in that. I'm almost positive I'm correct in the sense that God is speaking through him, but he isn't actually a part of the Israelite people. I always trip up on that.
Yeah. So essentially Balaam is hired by the king of Moab, is who it is, to curse Israel. Mm-hmm. He's a seer or a prophet, whatever, a holy man that's well known by obviously more than one nation. And so the king of Moab hires him to curse Israel. And he seeks Yahweh's kind of, it's this back and forth story that takes place, like you said, over a few chapters in Numbers in the 20s. And he essentially at the end of the day goes against God. He prophesies against, he doesn't do what God wants him to do and does what the enemy wants him to do, essentially.
What? Yeah, and he tells him how. So he tells this king how to get to the people. I forget the exact verse, and this is where I wasn't prepared as I should have been. My notes aren't. I don't have my notes for this, but there's a part in which he tells him, "Hey, if you if you have them worship idols and follow like their sexual desires, so if you send women into the camp, they're going to pursue those women, and God will do the destruction for you if you do that. And I forget exactly what verse that is, but and this is what the king does. The king says, okay, well, if I don't have to fight them, I can just send women into the camp. They can follow their sexual desires. Balaam will end up getting, a little bit of gain from this. And the ironic part is that this is the exact same thing Jude's talking about, is idol worship and sexual immorality bring forth God's judgment, which is exactly what happens to God's people in this instance, is that God actually does punish them for following idols and indulging in sexual immorality. That Balaam kind of gives the king an insight to. Again, I should have had better notes on that. And
Peter references Balaam as well in 2 Peter 2:15. He says that the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, like you said, it's the very same heart behind it. It's that sensuality thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's loved himself, loved gain, loved what he would get, even though he knew it very plainly. He knew.
Mm-hmm. Well, God told him how many times, you're not going to do this. Yeah.
He knew very plainly what was wrong and what was right in that situation. And because he loved himself so much, or loved pleasing himself rather. It's not really loving yourself to run into the gates of hell, but
he had a little gain from it, so he went for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we have Cain, which he used as an example, one that wanted his, and Cain and Balaam and Korah are all very similar examples in the fact that Cain kills purposefully out of anger, but also for power. Balaam does what he does for power and gain. And then we have Korah and Korah's rebellion. And again, I should have wrote this down, but Korah's rebellion is when Moses is the leader and Korah and some other people come and basically say, why are you the only one that gets to speak for God? Why don't I get to speak for God? Why don't I get to do this and have the power? And basically, attempts to lead a rebellion. God kills them. But all three of these examples are what Jude is pointing back and saying, this is who they are. These are the false prophets. These are the false teachers in the church, that they'll do anything for power. They'll do anything for gain, and they don't respect the authority that's been put over them. They're just like Cain. They're just like Balaam. They're just like Korah. Yeah,
and I think that one of the things that you also get from all of these examples he uses, which again, this is one verse and it's super loaded, right? This is just one sentence, but he's been talking about last week, right? And Jesus saved people out of the land of Egypt and afterward destroyed those who did not believe. The angels knew their role, knew their place, knew what their job was, knew God and how fulfilling he was, and yet did not stay within their own position of authority. So there's judgment for them. Sodom and Gomorrah, who indulged in sexual immorality, pursued unnatural desire, punishment of eternal fire. And then he talks about these particular people whom he's actually addressing about for they walked in the way of Cain. So there's another example. What happened to Cain? Judgment, right? What happened to Balaam? Judgment. What happened to Korah and all those who rebelled? Judgment. And he begins verse 11 with woe to them for all these examples. That woe to them is an obvious, all throughout Scripture way to say, watch out, judgment is coming, like great judgment. This is not going to go well for you. So not only is he pointing out similarities here between the actions and the heart behind some of the things that are going on in this church here, and and similarities between that and people of old who were running from God, rebelling against God. But he's also pointing out that like you're going to have the same end, right? Like this is not going to go well for you. Judgment is coming. Woe to you. And he sums that up at the end of our text for today. Also.
Yeah. Well, and it seems to be, so even through this whole, I mean, not just in this letter, but a lot of the letters we read in the New Testament have this same theme of this warning. And this is where, like, clearly Jude has disdain for the false teachers and what's being taught. But at the same time, there's this hint of he's saying, like, he's still trying to warn them. Like, he wants the believers in the church to know that this is not at all what should be happening. But at the same time, as he even gives examples, like you said, they're probably sitting here listening to it the same time as everyone else. And even as they're listening, he's giving them like an opportunity to be like, look, that judgment's not here yet. It's not, but it's coming. And there's like even an opportunity for them to be like, maybe this wake up call, like, you are these people, you know what happened to them, you know their stories, you are acting just like them, and this is what's coming. But there's this, like, it doesn't have to be that way, sort of intense but yet soft, sort of like weird mish. Like you said, like, we don't have this a lot. Lots of times just condemnation, but he it's like a very, it's a very kind of father-like letter of like, I'm not going to stand for this, but it doesn't also have to be this way. But one day you're not going to have a choice anymore. So yeah, there's this real impending dread if nothing changes.
Yeah. And so should it be. Right. Yeah. And I think that again, you know, we keep as we should, we keep taking this writing from Jude, this letter from Jude, and putting it, you know, in our day and age, the application bit of it, right? And it's the same, right? Like our what Jude here is addressing directly the church, fellow believers, people who are not acting in this way, right? Is who he's talking to. But he's indirectly, because they're part of the same. He even says here, these are hidden reefs at your love feast. These are people who are among you now, right? Probably these are people who are hearing this being read right now to you, that are hanging out with you, that are, he uses the word hidden again, right? Like this idea of being hidden or crept in unnoticed, right? And they're there right now. And so part of what Jude is doing, he's addressing the people of God who are in good standing with God, warning them of these other folks, of this false doctrine, of this way of doing things, and he's calling them to make sure that you have the correct authority, right? And then at the very same time, with the same words, he's also warning those who are these people, those who are engaged in this kind of behavior and this kind of theological malpractice, right? Who are making their dreams and visions and whatever, doing whatever they need to do essentially to ensure that they get what they want at any point in life, to ensure that whatever sin they love that day is justified, right? And so he's also in this with the same words, engaging with them and warning them and saying, look, this is what happened to all these people. This is why God killed them, right? Like, so I think the same way that as I stand up on a Sunday morning, right? Like I have to preach to good news and encouragement to the people who are believers in our midst, and admonishing them and whatever's in front of me on the text, right? But at the very same time, I indirectly with the same words, end up addressing anyone who might be there that is not a believer or who is faking to be a believer. Anyone who is a hidden reef at our love feast that week, right? And so I think this is really fascinating to me, because this is a lot of what Jude says here is so direct. Like, sometimes you have to work to make application. But so much of what he says here is directly applicable without changing any words or any having to put it into different, it's just so directly applicable to where we are right now.
For sure. Yeah. And what you were saying when he's talking to him, like, there's this sense of, like, you're right. Like, they don't know who it is necessarily. And the dudes are just sitting there like, oh no.
Right.
Who else knows? Yeah, for sure. And I,
like the disciples at the Last Supper, right? Like, is it me, Lord?
Are you talking about me?
Yeah.
But it's this idea that, like, I like what you said about as far as when you're preaching, like, you have no clue when you're up there and you're giving the sermon. You have no idea, like, who that's going to hit, or maybe who that's going to apply. Like, we have assumptions as pastors as far as when we're shepherding a flock, like maybe, who's where and where they're at spiritually, but that's only like an assumption at best. God knows the heart. And, like, it's this idea that, like you said, like, he's giving this out. I think he probably knows better than we do who he's directing it toward. But the idea that there are people out there, and that you touched on what I think what we're going to look at maybe next week or the next, but, like, that are participating in all the functions of the church, and they're there and they're hidden, and this still this grace he has toward them. Like, that's what I'm just getting out of this, is this idea that he's like, look, it's like this immense warning. Doesn't have to be that way though. So cool. Yeah. Next week, guys, if you want to read ahead and be awesome and cool, it's actually not as many verses. Next week, we're only going through 14 through 19. So it's a pretty short section. And then a lot more of, we'll talk a little bit about Enoch next week. So I mentioned that in this episode, but it's actually mentioned directly next week. So we'll get into that. Cool stuff. Talk to you then. Bye.
Until then, continue for the faith.